Paradise, a weekly show sponsored by the City of Key West to help you keep your plants and garden growing. Now, here's your host, Landscape Coordinator for the City of Key West, Kathy Wolf.
Welcome to Plants in Paradise, a show which will explore some of the different aspects and perspectives of plants in the tropical Florida Keys. Today, we'll talk about landscaping and some of the different aspects of that. My guest today is Jody Rosenblatt. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here
Thank
again.
You. Good, thank you. My pleasure to be here again.
Jody did a show, I guess, several weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about the design process.
Of the house.
Of a house, right,
design.
The model and everything.
Yeah,
for the viewers that are just tuning in again for the first time, maybe you can tell me and the audience this evening a little bit about what landscape architecture is.
Well, landscape architecture is a profession, a design profession, as you know, and we use things like plants and brick and concrete as our paint, if you will, and most of the design is done on outdoors, not very much interior work, but the basic principle of the landscape architecture profession is to create environments for people that are in harmony with the rest of the surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the profession strives for.
Mm-hmm. So it's an extension then, although you're not working with interior, it is an extension of the living space of the home.
I work with architects and engineers and interior designers all together to make a complete environment.
Okay. Well, with your background and training, what would you say is one of the most important rules or things to consider when doing a landscape?
Well, when you're doing your home, probably the most important thing is to make a plan, to organize all of your needs and all the things you want to have and put them together into a drawing that says, you know, this is the beginning, this is the end.
This goes here and that goes there.
Just get it all on paper first, or like we did in that show, we did the model, which was a great way to do it. And then that's really the most important thing, is just to plan it all beforehand so you can avoid a lot of mistakes.
Okay. Well, there are different ways of getting ideas for a plan, and I think we'll look at one of those. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we're doing this evening on the show.
Well, this evening I think the idea was to show how nature can be a teacher, and we went out to Bahia and took some footage out there to begin to explore how the natural environment is responding to the sun and the wind and the salt spray. And I think that the most important thing in terms of trying to figure out what you can do on your house or on a project that you're trying to do a design for is to think about what would have happened there naturally. And to a landscape architect, that's one of the most useful teachers, is nature itself. And that's really what the tape out at Bahia was about, was to try to take a look at nature and see what its lessons were.
Nature is a model or a teacher.
Right, lessons from nature.
Lessons from nature, all right. I think we'll go to the tape now, take a look at that, and
see if we learn the lesson.
Right.
Okay.
Before we do, I'd like to thank the staff at Bahia Honda State Recreation Area for allowing us to come in and tape, and for giving us a very welcome assistance
they were really
out
great.
there.
They were
right.
great.
Okay, let's go to the tape.
The first thing to remember about Bahia Honda is that it's representative of the Keys. When you're looking at the landscape in the Keys, you see many different types of systems and many different situations occurring. This section right here that we're walking is very close to the water. There are mangrove systems, and there's a system called the transition zone, which is about 6 inches higher than the water, but just as close, possibly. And as we walk up the path here, you can see the palms and some of the other trees of the hammock. I guess Kathy, the most important thing to learn overall about the Keys is that we have a tremendous diversity of plant material.
Right. I'm very interested in the native plants, and the Keys are a melting pot of plants that grow up north and the more tropical type of plants. So we have a wide variety of different things, different shapes with the palms and different leaf sizes.
Yeah. Then in some of the beach systems, which is not too common on the Keys, but on Bahia, of course, we have that sand beach. I think we start to see how nature responds to the influence of wind and salt, and this is a very important lesson. Look what nature has done right up against the beach. The material is low. There are certain plants that are very, very tolerant of salt. And as you go further away from the beach, you get into higher materials until finally when you go all the way up to what that dune ridge where those palms are, you have almost, if you look across the image here, you've got almost steps of plants getting higher and higher.
And thicker, too. I noticed, too, it becomes more dense as you get away from the water line.
Right. So I think that, you know, when you have a situation where your site is right up against the beach, look at what nature has done. It's planted sea grape, it's planted sea oats, it's had one layer going up higher and higher to the next layer. And that function of the one layer in the front protecting the layer in the back from the salt and the wind is a really important function that nature is playing right here with the plants. So if you try to do something that is just a single plant in the middle, you know, right in front of the beach, like a hibiscus, and you have problems. The reason why is that you haven't learned this lesson from nature, to stack your plants up.
And provide that protective barrier or different steps.
Right.
Another thing, occasionally people talk to me about salt tolerance. I think it's important to remember that the salt is in the soil, but it is also coming from the atmosphere, the spray that blows up with the wind.
Look at here, how glistening everything is. Every plant there is coated with salt. You know, you could, when we were out there looking close, you could see right up. And you notice here what we're getting is a plant that's just making a thick mass right up against the shoreline. That's the sea grape. It's a really good plant to use if you need something that's salt tolerant, because as you see, nature has used it in real abundance. And this is another one here. This is the scaevola, or the savola, which is a lower shrub. You know, as we're talking about the stacking up, it sits in front of sea grape usually in nature.
I should mention there are two different varieties of the savola. One is a native in the Keys, and another is comes to us from the Pacific, from Hawaii.
Yeah, we have a lot of plants here from Hawaii that people import, but all the plants we're seeing right now, as lovely as they are not imports. They occur naturally in this area. And as you can see, you know, it's really beautiful. Like, for instance, that brown in the front there, while aesthetically it might not be playing a very, you know, pleasurable role, it's certainly providing the food for the first row of grass behind that, which provides the food for the row behind that.
Mm-hmm. Here's one of my favorites on the screen now, the sea lavender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very rare and very hard to propagate. But as a focal point or a feature plant, it's something that has tiny white flowers and the blue-gray leaf, and it can really be quite an attractive specimen or focus in your yard, just as it's a focus out here in nature. I think the thing to constantly remember is when you're dealing with the shoreline, nature is saying, let one layer feed up to the next, and let that layer protect the one behind it, and let the ones behind it give some kind of structural stability to the salt and the sand and all of that, to give a whole protective system. And this system here doesn't need water or fertilization. Obviously, it's a state park, and nothing is done out here as far as maintenance, and yet you still have a real charming elegance just from the pure functional response of nature to the climatic effects
factors that are going on.
Shoreline, yeah. Now, a lot of people don't have shoreline properties, so they might not have this same kind of thing, but we'll get into the hammock in a minute. The point about the Keys to always remember is that the land comes from the sea. It begins as rock, and as time goes on, it builds up until finally maybe some of the seaweed that washes up on the shoreline can begin to hold a mangrove root or two, and you come a long way from a clump of seaweed to a full island. But nevertheless, you know, this island right here, Bahia, that we're looking at, is still being born from the sea. It's still having a buildup of one layer in front of the next. And of course, at the peak of the layer is the hammock. The hammock that we're looking at right now is on the dune ridge. It's the highest part of the land, and it's also the furthest back from the shore. So you get a lot more diversity. And
an area of the best drainage and the best protection. Very little wind in this area.
Right. So some of the plants that can grow here, while it's only 20 feet from the shore, they can't grow on the shore. You can't, you know, the plants will go out there and it'll just die from the blast of salt and sun and wind. I guess the thing that always strikes me about the hammock is that the soil that's been allowed to build up over time is covered with a layer of all the leaf litter. And actually that's part of what makes up that soil function. So when you're in your garden and you're trying to plant an area that's up higher and would have been a hammock if it had been natural, you have to remember to reintroduce that leaf litter, you know, and the thick soil mulch in order to have a healthy system that won't require constant maintenance. It's ecologically a lot healthier, and when you have a thick mulch, which is just broken up leaf and you know, branch litter and stuff, it tends to conserve water because it'll hold it in the soil. It doesn't let it evaporate as much, and it's a very nice surface to walk on because it's softer than the pea rock, which is something you really want to stay away from.
Mm-hmm. Also, the leaf litter and any other type of organic mulch is cycling nutrients, returning those to the soil and maintaining a more healthy tree, shrub, whatever happens to be planted.
Right, and then when you get into the heart of the hammock, you'll get these tremendous trees down here for the Keys. And as you can see here, that leaf litter is still present. It's still holding the moisture against the ground and still feeding this gumbo limbo, which is one of the most remarkable trees in the Keys. You can transplant an entire tree almost by just cutting it at the base and moving it and just sticking it in the hole in the ground.
Plunk it back in the ground and off they go.
Very unusual tree. I think the thing about the hammock, functionally, that's happening is, of course, you've got a lot less light coming in. When you're on the edge of a hammock or you cut a hammock and all of a sudden all that light hits the side of the hammock, there are a group of plants that will come in, like the blackbead that we see in the foreground here, and this very pale green along the edge there, which is a mixture of blackbead and lantana. They come in to protect the base of the trunk of the trees. Now, what this is teaching us is that the hammock trees cannot take a lot of sun on the trunk, and that immediately nature will set up these fringe or protective plants.
A skirt then around the edge of a damaged hammock.
Right. So if you have a clump of trees, you can protect the edge of it with some of these fringe plants. And then, of course, when you're trying to come up with a fountain or a pond, it's always good to find these special little places in the Keys to give you some ideas and inspirations. This is a tidal lagoon that feeds the fish that feed the ocean that feed us, I guess. So lessons from nature in terms of function is just about that.
Right.
I guess we should.
Okay. You can use water then and probably some other textures as focal points for a landscape. And inevitably, the wildlife will come in if you have a good system and a nice setting of plants. We are talking to Jody Rosenblatt, landscape architect, and this is Plants in Paradise. We're going to take a few moments for a break. Please return with us. Welcome to Plants in Paradise. Jody Rosenblatt is my guest this evening, a landscape architect, and we just finished viewing a film from Bahia, Honda, trying to learn some of the aspects or some of the different things that we can see while looking at nature and observing nature and helping us to plan a landscape. Well, we're going to take a look at that film again, and can you tell us why, Jody?
Well, I think that there are two really important parts with trying to figure out how to do a design. And one is the aspect of some of the functional considerations, like how does the sun affect my site? You know, can I put up a shade tree? Okay. You know, do I need shade-tolerant plants?
For example, that idea of barriers and buffers that we talked about while looking at
where one protects the other from the salt. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be like that. But if you look at that same thing with a little bit of a different eye, like the eye of an artist, Because landscape architecture is a lot like that. It deals with the science, and it also deals with art.
With the art.
And what we want to do now is look at the tape again, but this time focus on what the lessons are that nature's teaching us about aesthetics.
All right. Well, let's take a look at it again then.
Okay. Color, form, function, and many other aspects of art are all represented in the landscape of the Keys. I think one of the first things that the Keys has to teach you visually is the idea of the island, which is a central clump in the midst of lots and lots of water. About 80% of our landscape is like that. But if you look at the color in the Keys, what you see are a lot of golds and greens. At least that's what I've noticed. And that's a very unusual combination. Most landscapes up north, you know, you're getting a much richer Kelly green and stuff. The other part that you have to remember to look at is the idea of texture. And in the Keys, what you're looking at here is a diversity of textures caused by the palm and also by some of our small leaf friends. And we tend to have a very fine or feathery texture in the Keys. A lot of your plant identification can be done very quickly by just recognizing that one is a different texture than the other, or one is a different color than the other. You start looking for shades of green in some of the landscape around the Keys, you'll see what I'm talking about. I think in the shoreline, a lot of what you begin to see is a formal, in terms of formal consequence, is this idea of a wedge. You have a shape of the land. It's low in the front, and it gets higher and higher as it goes away from the shore. So forgetting about the idea that one plant is protecting the other and you're stepping up, what you actually are seeing is in fact a formal representation of steps, one layer leading up higher and higher into the next. I think that that aspect of the visual quality of the Keys is one of its most unique and most interesting aspects.
You mentioned form and texture. I think each of those different layers or mounds tends to take on a different character too as you move from the low to the very high.
Yeah, you'll get sometimes in the higher ones you'll get a much rougher, coarser texture, and up near the front it's real fine and feathery. So if you wanted to learn an artistic lesson from the Keys, it would say place low, feathery, fine plants near the front and go up to rougher and bolder leafed plants like the palms and some of your 7-year apples and plants like that.
Right, right.
So that you'd actually be recreating that image of the Keys.
And that might be the place too if you wish to add some exotic plants that are a little more colorful, say the blossoms add more color. That would be the area to do it, in that protected zone.
Behind. Yeah. Because really, you know, most of the plants that we're talking about here and most of the images that we're seeing here are your basic structure of the island or your garden. You know, these are plants that you would use to establish your basic form. But even here where we're looking at Scaevola, you can see a blue-gray greenish color mixed in with a dark greenish color. So you are still getting a variety and an interest of color that maybe you'd normally expect to see something like Croton if you really wanted a lot of color, but that would be more of an accent use of color, which is what happens in nature. You know, I think what we're seeing is maybe lots of different textures and different colors and different forms, and that's teaching us about the variety that's there and the diversity that's there. But then there's always this one plant that just has unique color, unique shape,
just
unique
stands
form.
out no
stands
matter
out
what situation it might be in.
Right, and instead of a Croton, which gives you that unique thing, you can also get that same color and interest from, like we spoke about before, from the sea lavender.
Right.
And there are several plants that are like that are native and that can give you tremendous pleasure as a focal point in your design. But you have to get to know them a little bit. You've got to study them. And there are several books available on the subject of native plants. But I think the important thing is to realize that that blue-gray green, you know, against a darker green background, makes that plant a focal point in
Brings
this whole
it out,
landscape.
emphasizes it, and makes it more visible then.
That's right. Now the other thing that we see a lot of in the form of the landscape in the Keys are these multiple layers that build up this wedge, and also I think without even realizing it, the diversity that's there. And this picture right here where there are 4 plants present. Can you see all of them? Can you tell they're there because of the color? Like right there are 2 scaevolas, the native one on the right and the imported one from Hawaii on the left. One's dark green, one's light green. So when you're looking at a landscape, it's important to look for those subtleties. And then, of course, in landscape architecture, we use water in the design, and we use rocks. And trying to come up with an arrangement of rocks, like if we look at these, we see that the rocks are buried in the water. They're not necessarily plunked on the top unless they were thrown up by the sea. But every rock there, 2/3 of it is underground.
So they have roots.
Rocks have roots.
Like a plant, they have roots.
So the thing that you always want to remember when you're dealing with rocks aesthetically in your landscape is plant them. Plant them deep in the ground so that they'll connect with the earth, and that'll give you that emotional feeling that they came from the same place, you know. Now, how many plants can you see there, Kathy, just by looking at the color and the
There could be
texture?
easily 20 within that one frame or that one view.
Yeah.
And the Keys vegetation, as you said, up north, things tend to stand out more. I think the differences in the plants are more subtle in the Keys, but I don't think that makes them any less beautiful. If you select certain ones and use them to highlight others, I think you can have a beautiful effect with a native landscape.
Right. Well, I think the other thing to remember, too, is that the form, like you notice the plant on the left that has those long tongue-like shapes. That's called a spider lily, and the ones in the back are just more of your regular old trees, you know, with the little round leaves. But if you use the spider lily as a coarse textured, you know, unusual plant, you can sometimes, like in the front of your yard or where people are going to be close, you can create more depth in your yard by taking a coarser texture to and pushing it in the front of the design, and then using a lighter, finer textured plant in the back of the design. They tend to exaggerate your perspective and get a little bit more depth out of your yard.
Oh, so you actually then get a visual feeling that your yard is bigger than it really is.
Right, by just using different textured plants. So even though there might not be a color difference, you're still getting, you know, a tremendous amount of aesthetic value from the plant. I think the thing, too, here is that the brown color of the ground is, you know, nicer to look at than maybe a bright glaring white. And while that mulch has a function that we talked about of keeping moisture against the roots, we still have an aesthetic value of a dark, you know, warm or shaded color in there, which gives a nice base plane to be able to...
Right, far more relaxing than having a white glaring environment or ground area.
So if you look for color, texture, line, and form in the plants and the landscape that you see around you, you'll learn an awful lot about the aesthetics of the Keys and how you can recreate that and be in closer harmony with nature by doing it. I think that's one of the most important objectives, is that harmony with nature.
And there are many areas in the Keys where you can go out, walk around, observe the different plants and possibly some of the animals. Big Pine, I think, is one of the best. The Pineland Trail, that is...
And Bahia Honda.
Bahia Honda is beautiful.
Bahia Honda is great. I mean, there's 50 different colors and textures right there. But, and then of course you always have the changing of the season. And those flowers of the blackbeet are a prime example of the beauty of that. They also smell terrifically.
The bees love them too.
Yeah.
Once again, the idea of water as a focal point, as a way to accent the plants. Good example of that here.
Yeah, the use of water, the only thing you have to remember in using it is that it wants to go flat. And if you want to make it do something other than flat, you're going to be talking about a lot of different forms and different earth and rock use in order to create that. If you stay flat with it in your container, you'll wind up with a very simple and beautiful form.
Well, Jody, I want to thank you again for
you're welcome.
joining me on Plants in Paradise.
My pleasure.
And my thanks to the viewers also. Join me next week, Tuesday, 8 o'clock, again for Plants in Paradise.
Plants in Paradise is sponsored by the City of Key West. Gardening product brand names are used for informational purposes only. Such mention does not constitute an endorsement of a product over others that may do the same job while used in a similar manner. Questions or comments on today's show can be sent to this station, Telecommunications Incorporated, 1700 North Roosevelt Boulevard, Key West, Florida, 33040.